Kavanaugh, as you know, this June the court delivered a blow to millions of public sector workers with its decision in Janus versus AFSCME. In a 5-4 decision, 5 of the justices overturned decades-old precedent, a case called Abood, that workers around the country depended on for fair salaries and basic rights. The Janus decision is important here because it shows how your nomination fits in a larger campaign that groups like the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation have been waging for decades. Their goal is to undermine well-established Supreme Court precedent that protects workers, women, and everyday Americans. In Janus, 5 justices overturned Abood, quote, because they wanted to, end quote. Those were Justice Kagan's words, not mine. Although the 5 justices went through the factors that for overturning precedent, it identified another, what they referred to as very strong reason for not following precedent, and that reason was, quote, fundamental free speech rights are at stake. In fact, the 5 justices said the rule for following precedent, also known as stare decisis, applies with perhaps least force of all to decisions that wrongly deny First Amendment rights. So it sounds as though the court is saying that First Amendment rights takes precedence. So why is this important? It's because of the larger political campaign by groups like the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation that I mentioned earlier. So with the help of these groups, the Supreme Court, as Justice Kagan put it, has been, quote, weaponizing the First Amendment in a way that unleashes judges now and in the future to intervene in economic and regulatory policy, end quote. And in fact, just this past year, the First Amendment was used to advance a political agenda against workers and women's health and reproductive rights. Judge Kavanaugh, do you agree with the 5 justices in Janus?
Senator, that's a precedent of the court that, of course, because it's one of the recent cases, I can't comment on whether I agree or disagree with it, but it's a precedent that is now part of the body of the Supreme Court case law.
And of course, as should you get on the Supreme Court, you can either follow that precedent or overturn it. But basically, the court in Janus said that they came up with a very strong reason for overturning even decades-old precedent if First Amendment rights are at stake. So based on the answer you just gave me, then that kind of rationale would also be the precedent of the court now. So the Supreme Court sets precedent, of course, and all it takes is 5 votes to overturn precedent, as happened in Janus, 5 votes. And I'm particularly troubled that the 5 justices in Janus claimed it did not matter that public sector unions had relied on the Abood case for decades. And yesterday, when you talked about the role of precedent, you talked about, you used words such as how people rely on the precedent, whether it creates stability, there's predictability. But the 5 justices in Janus, the fact that public sector unions have been relying on the Abood decision for 41 years didn't matter. So 5 justices also claimed that they could overturn Abood as well as a well-established precedent because public sector unions were on notice. This is quoting the court. Notice for years regarding this court's misgivings about the Abood case. But as Justice Kagan explained, this so-called notice was actually Justice Alito's 6-year campaign to reverse Abood. So I won't go over his 6-year campaign, but suffice to say that Justice Alito made it very plain to potential litigants out there who wanted to undo the Abood decision. Basically, he said, come on over, because I want to be in a position to be able to reverse Abood. And the only reason in an early case called Frederick said that Abood was not overturned was because of the death of Justice Alito. And then after that, Justice Gorsuch was confirmed, and Justice Gorsuch was going to provide the 5th vote, whereas in the previous vote, because of the death of Justice Scalia, the earlier case of Fredericks ended in a 4-4 tie. But then along comes Justice Gorsuch, and the 5th vote was there, and Abood is overturned, and Janus is now the precedent case.